Call meeting to order. Just a quick question, I guess, to people before we start. On Wednesday, we have votes at 6 o'clock, and we're in the Wellington building, and we have 16 witnesses, which normally should take 3 hours. We really don't want to leave them sitting idle while we come up and do 5 or 6 votes. Are we willing to tighten the panels up to about an hour and 7 minutes per panel, which would mean we could get out of there at 5:45. We could go to 5 questions, 2 from the Liberals, 2 from the Conservatives, 1 to the NDP. Which would be about 5 minutes questions. Are people okay with that, so that we can give them notice now? Because they are video. Part of the problem is the second panel is 2 separate video conferences as well. So we need to line this up. Are we okay with that? Okay, then the clerk will inform the witnesses. Thank you all. Then turning to the business at hand. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, study of the report of the Bank of Canada on monetary policy, and we're most fortunate to have Bank of Canada Governor Mr. Paulus and Deputy Governor Ms. Wilkins here. You have the floor, and I believe you have a presentation to start with. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Senior Deputy Governor Wilkins and I are happy to be here before you today. It's our normal practice to appear before this committee twice a year to discuss the bank's monetary policy report. We published our latest MPR last week, and we're happy to answer questions about it and other economic topics. However, I suspect you may also want to ask about the agreement with the federal government that was announced this morning, which renews our inflation control framework for another 5 years. So before we respond to questions, allow me just to say a few words on both topics, beginning with the MPR. Now, since our last appearance, there have been 2 significant developments that led us to downgrade our outlook for the Canadian economy. The first is a lower trajectory for exports. After a sharp decline in goods exports over a period of 5 months earlier this year, we had a significant rebound in July and in August. But that has not been enough to make up for the ground that has been lost. Now, we worked hard to determine the reasons for this shortfall, and about half of it can be explained by weak global trade and composition changes in the U.S. economy. However, the rest is unclear. So in our outlook, we now assume that longer-term structural issues such as lost export capacity and competitiveness challenges are responsible for the remainder. This assumption led us to reduce the projected level of GDP by the end of 2018 by about 0.6% compared with our July projection. The second major factor behind our downgraded growth outlook is the federal government's macroprudential measures to promote housing market stability. These measures are welcome because they will, over time, ease vulnerabilities related to housing and household imbalances. And that's important because such vulnerabilities can magnify the impact of negative economic shocks. We expect the government's measures will restrain residential investment by curbing resale activity in the near term and lead to a modest change in the composition of construction towards smaller units. And we estimate that this will leave the level of GDP 0.3% lower at the end of 2018 than projected in July. Now, given these 2 sets of developments, we have cut our growth estimate for 2016 to 1.1%. The expansion in both 2017 and 18 should be around 2%, which is above the growth rate of potential, which I'll remind you is around 1.5%. However, because the output gap is now larger and will close later than we projected in July, the profile for inflation is now slightly lower. We project that total CPI inflation will remain below 2% through the end of this year and be close to the 2% target during 2017 and 18. The outlook is clouded by a number of uncertainties at this time. These include First, the macroeconomic effects of the new mortgage rules. Second, the likely path of exports. And third, the impacts of the federal government's fiscal measures. And fourth, the effects of the U.S. election on business confidence. Given the two-sided nature of these uncertainties, and with the flexibility inherent in our inflation targeting framework, we judged that the current setting for monetary policy remains appropriate. So let me talk now about the renewal of the inflation targeting framework. Aujourd'hui, la Banque et le gouvernement ont
Today, the bank and the government announced that we will continue to target inflation at the 2% midpoint of a 1 to 3% range for another 5 years. This is good news, as our framework has served Canadians well in both calm and turbulent times for 25 years. The framework's track record is impressive. Annual inflation has averaged almost exactly 2% since 1991. Inflation has also been more stable, which has meant that unemployment and interest rates have become lower and more stable. In turn, this has helped households and firms make spending and investment decisions with more confidence, encouraged investment, contributed to sustained growth in output and productivity, and improved Canada's standard of living. As is the case at every renewal, a great deal of research and analysis went into the process, and we took on board the experience and lessons of the past 5 years. Bank staff published dozens of research papers and worked with researchers from other central banks and academic institutions, as well as private sector economists. And as usual, we asked some fundamental questions to make sure inflation targeting is still delivering its economic benefits effectively. We examined potential alternatives to inflation targeting to see if they provide even more benefits. That is one of the great advantages of our 5-year renewal cycle. The framework is not set in stone. We are always looking for ways to improve it.
Years of very low interest rates, the recovery from the Great Recession in many economies remains weak. So it's not really surprising that some are wondering if monetary policy has lost its power. Low interest rates are actually doing a great deal to support the economy. To illustrate this point, if we were to raise interest rates to pre-crisis levels, say 3 or 4%, there would be a significant contraction in the economy. And it's these contractionary forces that we are offsetting with low interest rates today. But while monetary policy is still powerful, it's true that at the current setting, the impact of any interest rate reduction is less than it would be if rates were at historically normal levels. That's the case in a number of economies. In this environment, it's particularly important that all policies, monetary, fiscal, and macroprudential, be working in a complementary way. This is why our agreement with the government is crucial. The government is making it clear that it also supports low, stable, and predictable inflation, while leaving us the independence to pursue that goal as we see fit. It's a framework that has worked extraordinarily well for 25 years, and after looking at all the evidence, we could find no compelling reason to change it. With that, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Wilkins and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paulos. Starting with Mr. McKinnon, 7-minute rounds.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bienvenue, Madame.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, Ms. Wilkins, Mr. Governor Paulos. We'd like to thank you and we would like to congratulate you. I think that there has been a fairly wide consensus. I will not claim to speak for my colleagues. There has been a large consensus about the inflation targets, and I'd like to congratulate you on entering into this renewal with the Government of Canada. The last remarks that you made, the subject I'd like to raise with you this afternoon, deal with the marginality or the very small impact of new measures on monetary policy. If I've understood you correctly, at the present stage in Canada and in other countries as well, and as well as the need for fiscal policy. I won't put words in your mouth, but for this policy to take over and to bring about an advancement in the economy. I'd like to know whether you can tell us some more about what you have observed on how not only Canada but also other countries would be able to improve their monetary policies and their fiscal policies in order to accelerate growth in Western countries. Thank you. It is indeed an emerging consensus in the world but I think that perhaps too much emphasis was put on monetary policy following the crisis. Immediately after the crisis, we saw in all countries of the world both fiscal and monetary policies being used at the same time. And about 2 years ago, we saw that there was a fairly significant rebound or recovery. And it was agreed that most of the work had been done then. Today, we realize that it was too early for us to say that we had, in fact, had a victory here. And the fiscal aspect had to be better balanced, and monetary policy became more expansionary during the second phase. Today, I would say that there is probably a consensus, not in every country. It's not accepted everywhere. But we find ourselves in a situation where monetary policy does have incremental effects. The incremental effects will not be as great. This is a very similar situation to that we saw in the Great Depression during the 1930s. And this was the time that Keynesian theories came into play, that fiscal policy was considered to be more appropriate. I would say that the mix of these two policies isn't something important. We have a 0.5% interest rate rather than something lower because fiscal policy is more expansionary. In your opinion, what would the impact be on the Canadian economy? I know that you don't want to wish to comment on the possibility of what might happen in the United States. But I think that there was some talk about possible increases in the interest rates in the United States in the near future. What do you think the impact would be on the Canadian economy if this were to occur? What is the degree of sensitivity of Canadian economy to interest rates? First of all, I'd like to say that we do have an independent monetary policy from that of the United States. And we are in a situation where economic forces are rather contrary. 2 years ago, both economies found themselves in a very similar situation, but with the petroleum shock, this reduced the rate of growth in Canada, but it did have a positive effect, positive net effect on the American economy. And during this period, there was the downward adjustment of the price of oil, and this had an impact on the Canadian economy. There are ingredients here for a divergence between the two countries that may last several years, perhaps 3 years or more than that. And in economic models, it is expected that there would be a divergence of monetary policy as well. It is true that eventually, if there is a process of normalization beginning in the United States with interest rates, this will have an effect on our bond market. It is a global market, and it will have effects in Canada. We'd have to analyze them when the situation occurs, because it is difficult to make estimates of what the repercussions or consequences would be, and I don't think it's appropriate for me to make comments right now on what the monetary policy is in the United States. This will affect things in Canada. It is true, but I think it is important to emphasize that our policy is an independent one. Productivity or output, I know that our colleagues will have something to say about this. The competitiveness of the Canadian economy, this was highlighted in your report. You refer to certain gaps, the capacity gap or output gap. What things could be done, and how can monetary policy have an attenuating effect? At the present time, it is true that there is an excess of economic capacity. It is clear in the market, the labor market and production. We've seen a number of symptoms of this, and the level of the gap is exercising downward pressure on the inflation rates. This is another process that will eventually be eliminated. We hope to eliminate this gap, and it would probably take about 2 years. Around the middle of 2018, we expect that this gap will be closed. And it is clear that the interest rates are encouraging growth, but other policies could have the same result. Particularly fiscal policy. The two of them work together in order to close this particular gap in the coming 18 months.
Chair, Madame Wilkins, Monsieur le Gouverneur.
Ms. Wilkins, Mr. Governor, it's an honor to meet you today and to have an opportunity to exchange with you. And I'd like to congratulate you, Governor, on your French. I've had the opportunity to listen to you on a number of occasions, like all Canadians. And seeing this exchange, then, I would like to, with my colleague, I'll continue then in French, if that suits you. My accent is not so good. I didn't notice. Could you explain why, in your view, the growth of the Canadian economy is lower than what you expected? You're talking about lower at the present time, or more generally speaking? At the present time, our view of the situation is that it's due to two factors. First of all, we did see a significant recovery in exports. But during this particular period, exports did not grow as quickly as our models had expected. It is a gradual process, and there is a regular increase. We are closely following then this situation. It is not a new situation over the past 2 years, but we have done research and we made a downward adjustment to our forecast for exports. The cause of this are multiple, but it is clear that there has been a drop in international trade. Export levels have decreased, generally speaking, in relation to the GDP. And secondly, the American economy was very weak during the first months of this year. And the composition of the growth in the United States has changed during this period. For example, they've been building smaller houses than was the case. It probably reflects a demographic change, and this has an effect in reducing the exports of building materials here in Canada. And investment is a very important category for our exports. With all of these factors then, we've had a lower than expected trajectory for exports, and there's also been a small effect of the government's announcement relating to mortgages. This will probably have a slight reduction in the sales of houses, and there's a great deal of uncertainty relating to this particular estimate. And we are going to have to follow this situation very closely. I can understand from what you're saying that there are foreign factors and there are also local factors. For example, the new rules that were announced 3 weeks ago by the Minister of Finance with respect to mortgages. In relating to exports and investments for our small and medium-sized businesses, what impacts could measures such as increasing the Canada Pension Plan, imposing a carbon tax, maintaining taxes for small business at 11%. All these measures will have a direct effect on our small and medium-sized businesses as well as larger companies. In your opinion, do these three measures, that increasing the Canada Pension Plan for employers and employees, setting a carbon tax and maintaining at 11% a tax on small and medium-sized businesses, do you think that they will have an effect of stimulating the economy, or will they have a negative effect on our entrepreneurs? I would say that it's a fairly complex question, but there are indeed many elements that could encourage competitiveness and make our businesses more competitive. You mentioned a number of them. That could be in this particular package, but I don't have figures for each of these. It was mentioned last week. Certain elements relating to competitiveness. Each change will have a positive effect, but we'll have to study their individual effects with our models. Our models, for example, relating to international trade, there are more specific models relating to these. But more generally speaking, maintaining a tax at 11% for SMEs rather than 9%, do you think that it is something good for these companies? I don't think I can make a specific comment on that example. It is a level of tax that is fairly low in an international context, and I think that we are competitive in this area. But businesses also bring up a lot of other elements when we talk to them. They talk about deficiencies in infrastructure. They talk about the cost of electricity that's almost double in Ontario. When you make a comparison with Detroit or Chicago, it's almost twice as much in Toronto. They also mentioned certain other elements such as these. In my view, I don't think that they have raised taxes. And the setting up of a new pension plans where $1,000 per employee in each business, is it useful to have these additional charges for an entrepreneur? Do you think that it stimulates the growth in the economy? Once again, there are two sides to this question. Everything that does affect the cost of a business will have an effect on its competitiveness. But at the same time, we are going to have to assure people. We're going to have to encourage confidence in our households, and that this will have an effect on the demand in the economy. And if there is a change in the pensions, if there's an effect on their long-term confidence, then they will be spending more, and it is also possible that it will have a stimulating effect on growth.
We're well over. Mr. Caron.
Merci beaucoup et bienvenue, Madame Wilkins.
Thank you.
Party here, so I'll do both languages. I'd like to start by going back to something you said, which is, and I agree with you, that monetary policy is much less effective at such low rates as we've been experiencing. But I do remember that in the last few years, we've been debating about the famous toolkit and what we had as tools in the toolkit. We talked about quantitative easing. We talked about the possibility of negative income rate, negative interest rate, sorry. So the question actually is, if you think that the right move right now is to actually stand on the sidelines and let the fiscal policy do its work, those instruments, those tools in the toolkits, when would they be used if they are not used in a situation right now where monetary policy seems to be less efficient?
So in effect, our analysis is that given the shocks that we've incorporated into our projection, that the economy has slower growth, a larger output gap for longer, and that period of longer is on the order, takes us out to the middle of 2018. Now, on the one side, we'd say, well, that's unfortunate. We thought just a few months ago that by the end of 2017, we would be back at full capacity. So adding, say, 2 quarters on to that process means longer period of time where someone may be out of a job. It increases the side effects, if you like, the scarring or the loss of skill sets and so on. So we know that that's not without cost. But we also must ask ourselves, like, what is the complexity of the trade-off, and when is it appropriate to try to speed it up? So as we said last week, we discussed actively the possibility of cutting interest rates a little further at this time in order to try to speed that process up. And given the uncertainties that we're facing at this time, we decided we were best to hold where we are. And those uncertainties, when I say uncertainty, I don't necessarily mean something bad. It's to say that just some things that are not as concrete today as they might be in a short time. So for instance, a lot of companies mention that the U.S. election is giving them uncertainty about the future, whether it's about their investment plans, about NAFTA, or what. And it doesn't really matter which candidate ends up, there's uncertainty. And so there's a natural tendency, both in the United States and in Canada, to delay those kinds of decisions. So it's possible, therefore, that when the election is over, that some of that uncertainty will be lifted, and that would be a positive. So it's not all one way. But in that context, we decided the uncertainties were sufficient, that we should watch the export data a little longer and make ourselves more confident in that.
And you made comments on infrastructure and the spending on infrastructure, actually, that deficits might actually be positive if the infrastructure spending is actually bringing a good rate of return for the economy eventually. You also said that for any decision on the rates, there is a lag time before you see the effects, but that I would submit it's the same thing for infrastructure spending as well. The question is, how long are you willing to actually wait to see results on both sides, either for the decision on the rates or on the impact of infrastructure spending?
Well, I don't really have an answer to that question, but there's nothing mechanical about it. Each of these decisions is a complex combination of risks, and we have to weigh the risks of waiting longer against what are the costs associated with doing something more immediate. And certainly, as your first part of your question alludes, we are not far away from, if we were to be easing further, we'd be very close to using unconventional tools. And so that's, of course, not a decision we would take lightly. And when we have the Canadian economy operating on two tracks, one track doing reasonably well and in certain regions doing quite well, and others adjusting through something quite difficult, it's actually not as easy as it sounds to speed up the fast-growing parts to offset the slow-growing parts. If everything was the same, it would be in many ways an easier decision to do that kind of thing. So this is what I mean by the uncertainties. They're multidimensional. So we just have to we do a fresh judgment every time, and we can't plan it out that way. But our best plan right now, we think, is to wait for the next 18 months or so.
Merci. Une dernière question sur l'entente sur le ciblage de l'inflation.
One last question relating to the targeting of inflation. In the document, the joint document with the Ministers of Finance, you said that this was a method that has demonstrated its usefulness since it was created. But you will recognize that we find ourselves in a very different situation with slow growth at the present time, which was not necessarily the reality when this particular mechanism originated. There was always a 2% target.
Any possibility of actually trying something different, adding this as one more tool in the toolbox, as you said? And the other question is, have you considered having an agreement for less than 5 years, just to see, maybe we can try something else, we'll try it for a few years, and it might actually bring us different results in a very different economic situation?
Oh, good questions. I'm going to pass over to Ms. Wilkins.
Sure. Mais c'est vrai, effectivement, avec un taux de croissance moins...
With a lower growth rate, then it means that there's a savings rate that is higher. There's a neutral rate, a balance rate, interest rates that would be lower. And the question that this raises for us is, with an inflation rate that is targeted at 2%, the possibility that we might find ourselves in a situation where the interest rate is almost zero and could even be a negative. And we came to the conclusion that it would be almost the double, even though the rate is lower than the rate of 5 basis points rather, with the probability then of hitting the lower level and having to use unconventional monetary policy. We thought that we should perhaps give some consideration to raising the inflation rate for inflation to 3%. And when we had a closer look at this, we came to the conclusion that the possible benefits of this would be lower than the cost. It's very intuitive, because when we have a tax system where there could be a transfer of wealth between people who save and people who are borrowing, the inflation rate, an increasing inflation rate would put the costs probably on people with lower incomes as well as older people. So we said that if we are able to make use of unconventional tools, even though their effects might be limited, they would still be positive. There are studies showing that these are effective, so it would be better for us to stay with a fairly low and stable inflation rate that is foreseeable or predictable.
Sabera, 7 minutes, if you could.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Governor and Mrs. Wilkinson, Deputy Governor. Welcome. I'd like to start off with a couple comments. It's going to be a three-part question, if I can get it in there, so I have the full 7 minutes and respond. First of all, congratulations on the agreement that was the renegotiation, or no negotiation, but the policy statement on inflation targeting and going for another 5 years. Sending price stability to the market is very important for decision makers, whether you're a saver or investor, putting capital to work to know that's in place. So congrats there. My first question deals with fiscal policy. Governor, on your September 20th speech, living with lower for longer, excuse me, if I can quote you, it says here on policy prescriptions, one important impediment to business growth that is widely shared globally is weak infrastructure. We know that infrastructure projects spur growth in the short term by boosting demand. More importantly, infrastructure projects can support long-term growth by raising an economy's potential output. So with that statement from your September 20th speech, and really where monetary policy has done a lot of heavy lifting here in Canada, and the monetary policy transmission mechanism has worked very, very well here in Canada over the last number of years. But it's time for fiscal policy to take over, in my view. Now, I'd love to hear your wise words on that. So that's part one. The second part is to deal with two themes that have been identified from the Deputy Governor's speech in London that were re-emphasized in the monetary policy report that you've touched on, Governor. One is to do with labor supply, not labor participation rates, because they've kind of held steady if you look from 76 to now. Labor supply, and then the other one is productivity / what I call competitiveness. Now, the labor supply we can deal with immigration, I think. I think there's a solution there on the labor supply front, the labor growth rate. On the competitiveness front, on page 15 of the monetary policy report, there are a number of things that are concerning about our competitiveness and what are headwinds that are restraining export growth. So I would appreciate some feedback on what you think fiscal policy or policy measures that we may need to look at in terms of strengthening our ability there. And the third part and final part is to deal with some ratios. We widely are given the 170% number of debt to disposable income, but if I look at the Stats Can report where that number is provided, there are a number of measures on net worth of Canadians that we don't talk about. And I'm somewhat not concerned, but it raises a question on which side of the balance sheet we're looking. Because if you look at financial asset ratios, Canadians are generally wealthier than they have ever been. There's a lot more net worth there. And if I can get my iPad to open up, I could pull them up. So I would like to get your take. Thanks, Ron. I would like to get your take on the balance of it, looking at this one ratio, but in that same Stats Canada report, a number of other ratios point to a different picture of how the consumer is. So those are the three questions.
Okay. Well,
If you can answer those three lengthy questions in 3.5 minutes, it'd be great.
okay, so I'm going to take 1 minute, and then I'm going to give 2 minutes to Ms. Wilkins.
Sounds good.
So in my first minute then, yes, in the speech about lower for longer, I talked about our estimate is that the Canadian economy can aspire to a long-term trend growth rate of about 1.5% for the foreseeable future. That's our estimate of growth potential. The whole world has slowed down because of slower demographics. We're not accepted from that. In the U.S., it's only slightly higher. It's 1.7, slightly younger population. So 1.5%, and in that context, what is it that we can do to make the trend line higher? Well, we can remove some of the impediments to growth, which are structural things. These are not things that monetary policy is equipped to do much or anything about. Indeed, in the narrow sense, neither is fiscal policy. By structural things, we mean deficient infrastructure, which of course would mean providing better infrastructure, but it can be other things such as interprovincial free trade, it's free trade internationally. These are things that, when changed, can boost that growth rate by 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and pretty soon you're rounding up to 2 instead of 1.5. So that's what I was talking about there. And those policies, we have control over many of those policies. And of course, the one that's happening right now is the infrastructure plan, which will be welcomed by firms that helps them grow their business. Turning to labor supply, productivity, competitiveness, and the debt-to-income ratio, over to you, Ms. Wilkins.
In 2 minutes. So I'm going to... It's interesting that about half of the decline in Canada's growth and potential output is due to a slower growth in labor supply, and so there's a real focus on figuring out how to increase that. And of course, the arithmetics of it are that immigration could do that. I think there are other things as well that we've noticed, and that's just trying to look at the prime age worker participation rate. So getting those segments of the population, so discouraged men and women that perhaps haven't yet decided to join the labor force, are things that could increase the labor input to potential output. And there's also the youth. I mean, when you look at the part rates for young people since the crisis, they've declined, and they're probably not. The governor's standing line is they're probably not retiring. I think that's true. Some of them are in school, but some of them aren't, and they're looking for work and could be productive. And when I talk to firms, they talk about the need to have the right labor in the right place at the right time. So labor mobility, especially when you have the kind of shock that we have, where some areas are doing less well, but there are jobs in another part of the country. That labor mobility is just so important, and having the right education to fill the needs that are emerging are important as well. That's not independent with productivity. I mean, the governor already mentioned a few things that firms tell us with respect to productivity. Clearly, regulation and electricity prices and other things affect their decisions about where they're going to locate. You're right to say that on the measures of the health of the household, balance sheet, and their financial position, it's always wise to look at a number of indicators. And so looking at that aggregate debt to income ratio is one way to look at it. We delve in looking at net worth is another thing. I think the best way to look at the health of the household sector is to look at the distribution of those things. And so you can have a lot of those average numbers hide a lot that's underneath. And if you look back at our financial system review in June, you'll see that we did a really strong analysis of debt to income ratios and loan to income ratios, and see that a very high percentage and growing percentage of the population are taking on loans that are over 450% of their income. And that means that their debt service ratios are very high, and so it may be that they have an asset. Most of Canadians' assets are their houses. The issue, though, is that if they get into trouble from an employment point of view or an income stream point of view, they don't necessarily have those liquid assets that allow them to keep meeting their debt obligations. And so it's great to see that net worth is high, but that depends on the value of the asset and the stability of the value of that asset, but also the liquidity of that asset. So I think it's good to look at a number of indicators and look at the distribution across those indicators.
Thank you all. Mr. Albas.
Great, thank you,
Don't try
Mr.
with
Chair.
3 questions, because I'm not going to
And I appreciate Governor, Deputy Governor, for your commitment to our country and your service. I appreciate your presence here today and making yourself available to parliamentarians. I'd like to just talk a little bit about the government's growth plan. Obviously, you did an interview, Governor, on the weekend where you talked about, again, a percentage or a point of a percentage here or there could have a drastic input when we're talking about such anemic numbers, 1% growth versus 1.5 or 1.7. Obviously, infrastructure is a big part of that. Now, not all infrastructure is the same. When you speak of infrastructure, productive infrastructure, things that make us more efficient or allow us to grow our economy, what kind of things are you referencing? Because it's a bit of a hazy bubble out there for a general term, infrastructure.
Right. Well, you're right that not all infrastructure is the same, and the term I think I used on Sunday was targeted growth enabling infrastructure. Even that, I suppose, is a bit vague, but that's the filter that one would want to put on this. Would be if here's my infrastructure proposal. Okay, tell me then how that would be growth enabling for the economy. And so I hear people sort of say, "Well, if it's just a bunch of roads," and they dismiss roads. Well, I'm remembering the project to twin the road to the Maine border in New Brunswick, which made an enormous difference to seafood producers supplying the northeastern United States restaurants. They were able to promise much faster, fresher delivery, and so we actually saw the impact on exports of that.
Like the Confederation Bridge also, Mr. Easter pointed
Those kinds of things can make a big difference to business, and those are the kinds of arguments you'd like to hear.
Okay, well, the challenge I have is that about 2/3 of the $60 billion the government has kind of put in its fiscal plan over the next 2 years for infrastructure relates to green and social infrastructure that doesn't seem to meet those same category. Are you concerned the government is actually moving too much money around to too many areas that may not see the growth potential that you've been talking about?
So I'm not going to judge specific things that the government is doing on the fiscal front. I'm explaining that if you can make the argument that something will be growth enabling, then that passes that infrastructure test as I described it. You could think about infrastructure that may help women participate in the workforce more easily. And that would be social infrastructure.
Well, I don't think it's a good idea for us to use terms that become vague and whatnot. I think it's helpful. What I see is that there's the term helicopter money, where the approach is just to deposit money across the country, and there may be some stimulative effect versus what you've said in your comments, which are roads, ports, things that help us to be able to sell more of our exports, et cetera. I do take the point that there are investments the government can make, but I don't think it's under the terms of infrastructure. I think that's just terms like we talked earlier about inter-provincial labor mobility, participation, education. That's a little bit of a different thing. Now, how much growth? Because you've downsized, or at least you've downgraded the amount of growth potential you see, and so how much of it? So either the forces outside Canada and some of the things that are happening are worse than expected, thus downgrading it, or we're not getting as much pep for the investment, the fiscal dollars that the government's putting into it. Could you explain how much growth are we getting from the government's fiscal plan?
So the downgrade is almost entirely from external forces, as has been our series of downgrades. It's been a global disappointment, which has pushed down everybody's forecasts over and over again over the last 5 or 6 years. And in our case, primarily the U.S. And on the edge of that is just even a little less for us, because our share of exports into the United States has been gradually declining. So just to put it in context. Now, in terms of how much growth we expect from the fiscal plan, that it remains something to be monitored. What we have built in is approximately 0.5 percentage points this year, and 1 percentage point on the level of GDP by the end of the next fiscal year. And that remains, of course, to be seen, because in the data that we have available, there are no signs yet. It's a little early. We had the child benefit in July, so as we go through the rest of this year, we should see something in the retail sales data. But importantly, there's no category in the StatsCan publication that's going to tell us this came from fiscal expansion. So, it'll tell us, how much of a contribution government made to GDP, but that won't be mapped directly to the fiscal plan. It's important that we understand that. So, years from now, we'll be analyzing this episode, and the economists will figure out how much actually came. But that's very common, like some of the stuff that we've referred to from the U.S. infrastructure spending, where just looking at the components on roads and bridges delivered 3 times over an 8-year period, 3 times the initial investment. And that came both on the level because of the spending, but on the fact that those roads increased the potential growth rate in order for business to move their stuff around.
Thank you both, and I think after we get through our initial round, Dan, we'll have some time for a couple of supplementaries. Mr. Ouellette.
Thank you very much, Governor, for coming here today. I really appreciate it. I was just, I just as a philosophy point, I don't view the Bank of Canada as outside or above the economy, but as a part of it, an integral part of it. And I was just wondering, how many times a year do you meet with Indigenous leaders in this country?
I'm sorry, could you repeat it?
How many times a year do you meet with Indigenous leaders? I know you meet with the Prime Minister and other officials. I was just wondering, how many times do you meet with Indigenous officials or Indigenous peoples?
Well, personally, I've only met one time with an Indigenous leader when we were visiting Fort McMurray. Oh, excuse me. I met again when we were in Yukon, in Whitehorse. So there for over 2 years, once per year.
So, as you are the leader of one of the foundational economic institutions of our country, I was just wondering if you could share some of your views on the nation-to-nation relationship, and what the nation-to-nation relationship, and what you can do to further that relationship.
As the Bank of Canada?
Yes.
I don't have any idea how the Bank of Canada monetary policy, which just moves interest rates around, could have any bearing on that relationship.
Well, for instance, statistics are very hard to come by. For instance, on Indigenous unemployment in this country, on reserves, I know Stats Canada often has difficulty compiling it, and I know you use statistics an awful lot, you're economists, and I think, for instance, if you put in perhaps would push Stats Canada, maybe they might compile better statistics that would be able to inform your decision making, because I think we are making decisions, and it's just not one. Our societies are made up, or Canada is made up of many different societies and groups and peoples and nations within this one nation state. And so I'm just encouraging you, in a friendly way, to think about those issues. But I guess we were talking about social infrastructure as well. And the middle of the class and the poor spend a higher portion of their income on consumer goods and in the economy, and they don't save as much as some other groups in society in the upper classes or upper middle classes. I was just wondering if, you were talking a bit about the Canada Child Benefit that we put in place. Would you believe that would have a beneficial impact on people's lives as a social infrastructure, and would that be something that could be money well spent, and that people could use that money for educational purposes and trying to improve their conditions and economic and educational opportunities?
Well, I'm not in a position to comment on the specific nature of that policy and what all the various effects it could have. From our perspective, our primary interest is in trying to evaluate its impact from a macro point of view. How much of an effect would it have on the economy, and therefore on the things we talked about earlier, how much excess capacity we have, and how long will it take us to close the excess capacity gap and get inflation back to target. So in that sense, it plays a role there because it is expansionary. It's clearly an expansionary policy, so it reduces the output gap compared to what we would have without it.
Okay. And I guess just one final question. If we're talking about deficits, in some cases we've had low growth for a long period of time. If deficit spending in itself could be seen as being an investment if it's used in the right way in order to increase growth and to, get us over the hump so we don't have a recession or other long-term social economic impacts. Would you kind of agree with that statement?
Well, I would, but importantly, infrastructure spending has two dimensions. One is that you spend the money, and that increases jobs and in the actual building of the infrastructure. But secondly, if it's targeted in the way I described before, targeted at growth-enabling investment, it's not really different from what a company does, which is to invest in new machinery or equipment so the company will grow in the future. And that machinery then pays for itself as you go through time. So infrastructure should be seen in a similar way. If it's growth enabling, it will produce more economic growth and therefore tax revenues and so on to support it in the future.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll leave it there. I think we are stretching in some areas that the Bank of Canada does not have complete responsibility for, but that's fine. Good exchange. Mr. Lappert.
Thank you and welcome, Governor. I'm from Alberta, and there has been a view in the yesteryear, I think, that somehow if oil prices came down, the dollar would come down with it, and exports would increase, and we'd be back to the good old days, and that has not happened. There are strong indications that regardless of the outcome in the U.S. election, that the Fed is probably going to increase interest rates in the United States. Maybe you've got some information on that is different than what we certainly are led to believe. And if your monetary policy doesn't track that, the obvious result is going to be a lowering of the dollar. I'd just like you to make some general comments about where the dollar can go based on some monetary policies that we have little control over before it becomes an issue on itself relative to inflation.
Well, the relationship between the Canadian dollar and all those things is actually not very predictable. I mean, the one thing that we've seen as a steady indicator of the level of the dollar has been our terms of trade, which is highly correlated with the oil price in most periods. But it can be other things. If oil was constant and other commodity prices were rising, then the dollar might reflect that. It's and interest rate differentials, which you mentioned, are also a factor. But on any given day or any given period, those two things could move in opposite directions. You know, and it's not just the actual interest rates, but it's the expectations about interest rates which matter.
But how low can we go when it comes to the dollar? Where is your sort of head at relative to the dollar?
Well, I would decline to comment on the level of the dollar. It is, just as I wouldn't want to make a clear statement about where oil prices might be over a certain horizon. If oil prices were to rise, chances are the Canadian dollar would rise if nothing else were moving at the same time. But if oil prices went down, same thing. So I don't have, there is no magic number for us to have on that. It's driven by almost every fundamental in the economy. We only think about those two headline ones that you talk about there. But underneath all that is the economy's competitiveness, the forces that are acting on it, and the exchange rate is a major equilibration channel which is affected by almost everything in the economy and outside of our economy.
Okay, let me change direction a little bit. One of the things that we continue to hear, I continue to hear certainly in Alberta, is the continued piling on by government, whether it's increased taxes, in Alberta's case, whether it's in things like increase to the minimum wage, or you've mentioned on a couple of occasions now Ontario hydro rates, all in some way influenced by government policy, be it federal, provincial, whatever it is. We've got a situation now where we've got a huge deficit this year and for the foreseeable future at the federal level. We've got huge accumulating deficits at the provincial level. Do you have any kind of a sense as to how much longer we can continue to build those deficits before it starts to impact the dollar and all of these other numbers that we've been talking about?
Well, nothing exact. Historical experience certainly supports your main point, which is that deficits and government debt matter to primarily to international investors' impressions of an economy, and therefore their decisions tend to drive your currency around. And so we've had episodes in the past, like in 93, 94, 95, where we had very rapidly rising federal debt, and markets began to react negatively. And there was nothing magic about the level, but it suddenly started to happen that way. So so no one, including me, thinks that this is without limit, but we don't have really measures around those things, just a tendency.
But maybe no measures, but is it something that's starting to give you concern?
At this time, no. At this time, our fiscal situation is among the best in the world, and so I think for the time being, the government has considerable flexibility on that.
And that assessment...
Sorry, Ron, we're well over, but just to throw in a question here. So where's the debt to GDP ratio come into this discussion? I mean, we have been holding pre-budget consultations across the country, and to Ron's point, there is people who wonder what the roadmap is going into the future, where the government's going to end up. But when we talk to finance officials, they will come back to the debt to GDP, which puts Canada in pretty good stead, I understand. So what in that particular area?
So the federal debt to GDP is in the 30-odd% range, which is around half of what it was back in the mid-90s when we had this troublesome period. And so that is a very large difference. GDP is a very big number. So that is to say that there's I don't want to say that in some way there's all that gives you the size of the room to maneuver. It just says that there's quite a lot of room to maneuver, and from a financial point of view, and I would not want to express a specific limit on it.
Thank you, Governor. Mr. Greywell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Governor and Deputy Governor, for being here with us today. I just wanted to pick up on the comment that appeared in an article this morning or last night, that, and the headline read, "Canada has room to run deficits." Now, the average Canadian isn't going to understand monetary policy in depth, and when they hear, when they read a headline like that, it gives them confidence. And one of the roles of the Bank of Canada is to give consumer confidence in terms of monetary policy. Can you just elaborate on the fact that we're running these deficits in up to almost $30 billion? What is the room? Like, what is the gap? Where do we start to get into trouble in terms of the debt to GDP ratio?
Well, as I was explaining just now, there is no magic number for that. We have seen countries in the past get into trouble, let's just say, at debt to GDP ratios that are much higher than what we have here in Canada. And by much higher, I mean double, or in the case of Japan, it's 200. I don't know. I'm sorry. I forget.
Comfortable to say that.
Very large number.
So comfortable to say that when you say room, that means significant room to run deficits in our country.
Yes.
Thank you, Governor, for that. I also want to touch base on the concept of infrastructure. So we've traveled the country from coast to coast, and we've heard about the importance of government stimulus in growing the economy and economic growth, and infrastructure is seen as one of the things that the government can do to stimulate the economy. Now, you had a comment in the paper that said infrastructure can lead to tax revenues, which keeps the system turning. Can you comment a little further on what do you mean by keeps the system turning? And in the long run, the government's, like you also mentioned in the U.S., that it's 3 times the investment from infrastructure spending on roads and bridges. What do you anticipate that happening in Canada?
Right. So on the last part, let me start with the last part because I want to be very careful that I'm not confusing you. But in the United States, what I was referring to is an historical study by economists. What has infrastructure spending on roads and bridges, solely roads and bridges, done to economic growth? And what they discovered was in the short term, it has more or less a dollar for a dollar effect. But what happens is over the subsequent years, by 8 years, which is quite a long time, but that gives time for the growth rate to tick up a little bit and then that effect accumulate. So economists call that a multiplier. So, how big is your multiplier? And in that case, it turned out to be very close to 3 times the original investment, which over 8 years is quite a good return. But that's only one specific study. It's not a rule of thumb or anything like that. And in the case of the infrastructure program that's been announced here, we have simply assumed that the multipliers will be very conservative, basically a dollar for a dollar. Basically a dollar for a dollar. There's a little bit more than this. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's you're on top.
It depends on the source. So
depends on the
less
source.
than a dollar for the child tax benefit.
That's right.
More than a dollar for some of the other ones.
For the infrastructure side, slightly more than 1 for 1, and for the other moves, it's less than 1 for 1.
Oh, on the Canada Child Benefit.
So,
okay, thank you, Governor.
Yeah.
The last question is that, and my colleague from Alberta also mentioned this too, is that we have a lower dollar compared to the U.S. And generally, you would assume that exports would increase, but you opened up your statement saying that we've had a sluggish export market. And any other comments on why that's happening? You also mentioned that the U.S. election is causing consumer confidence to be at an all-time low, I guess. And how much is that a percentage of decreased export demand or investment in the American economy because people are worried about the outcome of an election?
Right. So it's important that we bear in mind that exports, Canada's exports have recovered tremendously, are now higher than they were pre-crisis. So there's a massive decline in the wake of the crisis and the global recession, and a very large recovery that took several years to complete. And all I was saying before is that even though that recovery has been very impressive, cumulatively, it has tended to fall short of what our models predicted. So the dollar has had the effects we expect it to have, but on average, just a little less than normal, not zero. And so we've done a lot of research to try and refine our models to try to capture effects that aren't always in there. And one of the important ones is the shift in mix in the U.S. economy, because investment in the U.S. economy is a really important demand source for our exports. And investment has been weaker in the U.S., and of course, not just the U.S., but globally. And so this is one of the reasons why virtually everybody's trade is slower than it was before. So we aren't alone in this. We're experiencing the same thing, and everybody's wrestling with the same issue.
You can squeeze in a quick one.
Thank you, Chair.
What quick?
Thank you, Governor. My last question is, obviously, your biggest tool in the Bank of Canada is interest rates and the adjustment of the interest rate variable. In terms of, and people are commenting, and when you read, the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, that monetary policy isn't, and you mentioned this in your comments as well, isn't as important of a stimulus as it once used to be. That the markets don't move, economies don't move as much when the interest rates change. So we've held the rate the same, and my colleagues mentioned, and I also agree with them, that the rate by the Feds may change south of the border. We have countries around the world going into negative interest rates. Your comments on how we could use, at this point in time, what would an interest rate cut do for the Canadian economy?
Well, an interest rate cut, what we have said is that interest rate cuts in this low rate environment are likely to have a smaller effect than they did when they were higher. But that's not the same as saying that low interest rates aren't doing anything. In fact, they're doing a lot. So what's important to bear in mind is that the relationships that we're modeling here are between interest rates and exchange rates and the level of the activity in the economy, the level of GDP, in the case of the dollar, the level of exports. When those things change, you get a move to a higher level, which means growth picks up. But growth picks up only temporarily, and then when the effect is over, the level stays higher, but the growth impact dissipates. Now, we're not usually in this situation for as long as we've been, and this is why those comments are more prevalent. Fact is that those things are having a very large effect. Just imagine what it might look like if we stopped, and so that gives you an idea of the counterfactual.
Thank you both. We're considerably over time. Mr. Caron.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais revenir sur la question.
Thank you. I'd like to return to the agreement on the targeting of inflation. Ms. Wilkins, you said that what was studied as a possibility was having a range of 2 to 3% with a 3% target. And you also said that the disadvantage of this would be much greater than any possible advantage. We're talking about an increase of 1%. This would be an increase of 50% in relation to the present level. I'd like to know whether other possibilities have become considered rather than 1%. Perhaps having a 2.25 or 2.50, and have any studies been done to determine what the comparative advantages might be in relation to costs?
That possibility. And I would like to put that in light also of the drop of the announcement that core inflation will not be used really as a benchmark anymore. We're going to have different types of inflation, of CPI. On the other side, in the last few years, we were a lot more worried about the possibility of getting into deflation than out of control inflation. So seeing that, I'd like to see what the thought process was at the bank on that issue.
Oui. À propos de, on a regardé effectivement 3%.
We did, in fact, consider the possibility of 3% between 2 and 4, but as is clear in our document, when we measured the benefits and hitting a lower level of interest rate, we did this for a number of intervals for as high as 4%. And you can see yourself. What is clear from this process is that the benefits are far from changing, but insofar as the costs are fairly steady, they would be the same. One of the reasons why it works so well is because there are certain very clear expectations about inflations, and whatever benefits might be obtained would be if the system were revised and people revised their expectations as well. With respect to the measures of the reference measures, for a long time we made use of CPIX, which removes the 8 most volatile components. We were talking about an inflation target, but the total inflation, if you look at a graph, you will see that there are lots of ups and downs. And generally speaking, it's because of energy costs for consumers. If we want to be able to lead the monetary policy in relation to inflation, we have to remove these components that are volatile. We studied various measures for reference inflation that are used throughout the world. They contain a number of criteria, And there were three other types that work. The CPIF is no longer useful. It was not an index that it was a great use to us, but there was not a single model that was a perfect one. This was simply a guide in our view then, and not a target as such, and we were of the view that it's best to keep those that work well as a reference. I have very little time, but I'd like to come back to this question of the target. I can understand quite well that the success of this agreement on targeting of inflation that's been in existence for a long time is because expectations are clear and it has a stabilizing effect. The argument that you're giving here is that in the future, for the 5 years when it'll be renegotiated, once again, we will not be changing our rates. We have a 5-year agreement, and this argument that you have means that we'll always have a target rate at 2%, because the expectations of the markets and the investors, those who have an impact, you consider this to be 2% to be sufficient. Will this remain as 2% even though it is a 5-year agreement? The bar is fairly high, but I'm not saying that it is impossible to change it for something better. There are certainly other factors that would have an effect, and we will be changing certain things that might help us in putting different questions for the next time. Since we are putting emphasis on non-conventional policies, we'll have a great deal of experience over 5 years, and we'll have seen what happened in other countries that are using this type of policy, and we will be able to see to what extent they are efficient or not. This is one aspect. There's another one as well. Over time, we've seen there is more indexing in the system. There are lots of things that are changing over a period of 5 years, so it would not be impossible for us to make changes in the future, but we do have to be sure that it's for the good.
Boutet, 5 minutes, if you could.
Thanks, Governor. I would like to just go back to my colleague, Mr. Leipert, on the question about the debt, the provincial debts, and you've answered the federal debt part of it. Should we care about the debt of the provinces? And as you are the Governor of Bank of Canada, do you care? How much do you care about the debt that the provinces are carrying right now?
Well, I think that the Bank of Canada, we care about all of these things. There's no question about that. And I don't mean to oversimplify when talking about only the federal debt situation, because obviously the provinces are also borrowing on international capital markets, and that debt counts too. I agree with you that it matters. It matters, but I don't have some specific numbers for you that is a bright line that we should be worried about.
Okay. In your April report, you said you expect 0.5% this year and 0.6% next year as a return from stimulus. TD Bank expects 0.1% and 0.3% respectively. Why is such a difference between your expectations and TD Bank expectations?
Oh, you said it was TD Bank?
TD Bank, Toronto Dominion.
Well, all I can say is that every economist and every economics team does their own analysis, and this is less a matter of opinion, but more a matter of modeling and the assumptions that go in them. So there can be many, many reasons why two different estimates could differ. Traditionally, the kinds of models that we use would show that if there was a government fiscal expansion, there would be a tendency for interest rates to rise in response to this, and would actually cut off some of the effect. If you look at any model that economists use, it will give you this result. But what's important is that you take the model into today's context. Today's context is one in which the economy has a great deal of excess capacity, whereas the original analysis would be where the economy is more or less where it belongs. So you get this kind of adjustment that happens. when you're in a situation like we find ourselves in today, where interest rates are very low, where there's indeed a risk, as we talked last week, that interest rates would need to be adjusted lower in order to get our inflation on target. In that context, you don't have those kinds of offsets that you often have in a standard model. So it is why we say that the mix of policy is such that fiscal policy has quite an advantage in this situation compared to monetary policy. Nevertheless, they both can work on the same issue at the same time, and it gives you a better mix than you would otherwise have. So all those possibilities are open. I'm not going to debate a specific estimate with you, but that's, the economists are like that.
I'm not going to go and say who should we believe or should we,
No.
But my third question is a short question.
Yeah,
quickly.
I believe, Ziad, you'll get a little bit different analysis. I see the parliamentary budget officer standing back there as well. I think he'll have a little different estimate too. Go ahead. Floor is yours.
Okay, you said that child benefits would or should drive retail sales up. Birth retail sales fell off by 0.1% in August for 3 months, also 3 months straight. Can you have any opinion on why this is happening? I mean, and why we're also, retail sales is driving down?
Well, I know why we had a decline in August. It was mostly because of automobile sales. And I don't think that the child benefit would be the thing I'd be using to buy an automobile. So I'm not sure we're getting a direct reading on that yet. I'd like to see a little more time. The checks have only been out there for a couple of months relative to the data. So, and maybe it's more of a back to school thing. I don't know. Well, we'll have to give it a little more time. We can never make a conclusion off of 1 or 2 data points. These are very noisy data, and always are. That's the problem economists have, seeing through the noise.
Do I have a
very short one?
Very short. Same on child benefits. I know this is one of the measures that should do a quick impact on enhancing the economy, improving the economy, the immediate stuff, at least to hold on, and then the kicks will continue to be. Nothing has made an impact, rather than we've seen a negative impact or a negative turn. Why? Like, instead of having at least a little bit of boost, regardless of how small or big it is, we've seen the opposite. How come?
I'm going to disagree with you there. We simply do not have the data to support a conclusion like that at this stage. It's simply too early to make any conclusion about how that fiscal impact will play out. None. It's just too soon.
We'll leave it at that and turn to Mr. McKinnon for the final questions. 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je pense que c'est clair.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that it's clear, and I'd like to thank the Governor and Ms. Wilkins for the time that they've spent with us. I think that it is clear from your comments that you have done your work. If I can describe it in such a way, you've done your job, and now it's up to the government to do its job through sound policies, through fiscal policies supporting the country's monetary policy. And we also know that psychology does have a big effect in an economic recovery. Do you think that the role of the consumer in the Canadian economy, with a special perspective on the mortgage policies, how do you see the situation of the Canadian consumer at the present time, and making a contribution or not, or could make a better contribution to the economic recovery? I'd like to thank you, but yeah, I wouldn't say that we have done our job. It is to the fiscal authorities to do their work. Monetary policy does have a certain latitude, and we are willing to make use of it if the data are not cooperative with us. But what we see at the present time is that the economy is in recovery, and we have made a number of conservative assumptions relating to consumption, and we expect that the economy will have a growth rate of over 2% next year. And this process will be starting then of dealing with excess capacity. In response to your question, you said that it is too early to assess the effect of the fiscal measures, but you seem to be saying, speaking in abstract terms in any case, that the fiscal measures taken by the government are necessary in order to support the growth. I think that we should be sure that we understand that fiscal policy at the present time, an expansionary policy, is necessary to ensure growth in Canada. I wouldn't say that it is necessary. It does help the situation. There is no doubt about that. But as I already said, the monetary policy does give a certain degree of latitude, and we are ready to make use of this. At the same time, there are a number of significant uncertainties. We have to follow the situation, the data over the coming months. I think that we will be getting greater clarity, but for the time being, we are keeping things at the present level, but are willing to take action. And the consumer, in your view, how would you assess the situation of the consumer and the state of mind of Canadian consumers? In our forecast, there is a table, and you will see that the consumer is continuing to make a contribution to growth at the end of this year, as well as in 2 coming years.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKinnon. And I note the bank's mandate is to conduct monetary policy to promote the economic and financial well-being of Canadians. You've had a lot of experience coming before this committee, Governor, as MPs try to get you to look into your crystal ball from various political persuasions. But I think as a committee that sits around this table, I think you and your team and Deputy Governor are to be congratulated on the work that you do, and we certainly thank you for coming forward today and answering the questions put to you. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair.
We will suspend for a few minutes for the Parliamentary Budget Officer next. We convene pursuant to Standing Order 108-2, study of economic and fiscal outlook before the Finance Committee. And with us this afternoon we have the Parliamentary Budget Officer and his team. And so, Mr. Fichette, I'll let you introduce your team and go from there.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Vice Chairs, and members of the committee. Je vous remercie encore une fois.
Thank you again for having invited us to be here today and to talk about economic and fiscal outlook, our October 2016. Today I'm joined by Mostafa Askari, Jason Jakes, Chris Mathieu, Tim Schultz, and Trevor Shaw, who will help respond to any questions you have regarding our outlook or other PBO analysis.
I would like first to note that our updated outlook reflects that the June agreement in principle and the Canada Pension Plan agreement enhancement. However, our updated outlook does not incorporate the government's recently announced measures related to the housing market, the carbon pollution pricing, or the indexation of Canada Child Benefit amount. The economic outlook. On balance, PBO's outlook for the Canadian economy is unchanged from our April report, as weaker real GDP growth in the near term is offset by stronger growth over the medium term due to increased provincial government spending, as well as additional monetary stimulus and lower long-term interest rates. Over the period 2016 to 2021, we project real GDP growth to average 1.8% annually, the same as in our April report. Average annual growth in nominal GDP, which is the broadest single measure of the government's tax base, is only marginally lower than we projected in April, 3.7% versus 3.8% in April. This revision reflects weaker GDP inflation in 2016. Adjusted for historical revision, the level of nominal GDP is, on average, $15 billion lower per year over the period 2016 to 2021 compared to our April report. Malgré cette révision à la baisse,
despite this downward revision, PBO's projected level of nominal GDP is, on average, $26 billion higher per year over the period 2016 to 2020 compared to the budget 2016 planning assumption, which included the government's downward adjustment to the average private sector forecast of nominal GDP. The fiscal outlook. Our fiscal outlook is largely unchanged from April. We continue to project that the deficit will decline over the medium term, falling from $22.4 billion in 2016-17 to $9.4 billion by 2021-22. Compared to our April report, we are now projecting slightly larger deficits in 2016-17 and 2017-18, but smaller deficits thereafter. PBO's outlook for the budgetary deficit over 2016-17 to 2020-21 is $4.8 billion lower on average than budget 2016. This difference is roughly in line with the government's forecast adjustment, which removed the equivalent of $6 billion in revenues in each year of its planning horizon.
The government committed to reducing the federal debt to GDP ratio to a lower level over a 5-year period ending in 2020-2021. This translates into a fiscal anchor of 31% or lower for the federal debt to GDP ratio in 2020-2021. Under current tax and spending plans, we project that the federal debt to GDP ratio will decline to 29.7% in 2020-2021. Consequently, based on PBO's outlook, the government is on track to reach its debt to GDP target 2 years ahead of schedule. As such, the government has flexibility within its current fiscal plan to meet the medium-term debt to GDP target. Sur ce, Monsieur le Président, mes collègues et moi serons...
My colleagues and I would be happy to respond to any questions you may have regarding our economic and fiscal outlook or any other relevant matter.
Thank you very much, Jean-Denis. Then turning to Mr. Graywell. First round will be about 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the officials from the PBO for coming to testify today. Your new forecast, you mentioned, didn't include the changes that we made to the housing market. Can you add some color in your opinion, the changes that we've made, how they will impact the economy?
We have taken that into account, not in an explicit way. It's sort of underlying our forecast because we already assume in our projection that the investment in residential construction would actually slow down over time. So now the measures that the government have introduced, certainly they will, in principle, they should reduce demand for housing and have some negative impact on the speed of investment in the housing sector.
Like locally, and this is obviously a very small scale example, demand hasn't slowed down. That, you know, if you look at housing across the country and in the markets, predominantly Vancouver and the GTA, it's driven mostly by demand and the shortage of supply. And although we've addressed, the government has had an opportunity to, you know, restrict the mortgage rules and introduce a stress test. In your opinion, in the long run, the government's changes to the mortgage rules, will they slow down the housing market, or will this thing, you know, kind of settle down?
Well, the objective is to slow down the housing. Whether that is going to happen in reality, that remains to be seen. But I mean, based on the rules and the principles, there has to be a sort of the negative impact on the rate of growth of residential investment.
We just heard from the Bank of Canada governor, and he was also quoted in the paper today that Canada has room to run deficits. And when I asked him a question about the extent of that room, he said significant room, that, you know, the government of Canada is well positioned to run these deficits. And you've also, in your latest forecast, said that the deficit will be $4.6 billion lower than the government is stating that it will be. What is that driven by?
Well, the difference between our projection and the government is mainly really due to the assumption that the government has made about the level of nominal GDP in their projection. They made an adjustment of $40 billion to nominal GDP as a prudence factor, and we do not take into account any sort of the prudence in our projection. Our projection, based on our view, is the balanced risk. So the risks are on the upside and the downside are balanced. So we do not make any room for any kind of a prudence in our projection. So that's really the difference between the two projections on the deficit.
Thank you. In terms of and we also asked the Bank of Canada governor the impact of interest rates, but you know, we won't get into that discussion here. The Canadian economy has always been very, very dependent, in my humble opinion, on what's going on to the south of us in world economic factors. And I asked this question to the Bank of Canada governor as well, is that the fact that we have a lower dollar compared to the U.S., and he said that, yes, that has also increased export growth, but we're still seeing sluggish exports. Any other commentary on why that's happening, on why Americans aren't coming to Canada to manufacture their goods, and that we're not having an increase in manufacturing because it's cheaper to make the products here and then, you know, ship them across to the south of the border?
Unfortunately, I don't think there is really a good answer for that yet. I think that this is being studied, and I know the Bank of Canada is studying these issues, and they are trying to figure out why exports have have been weaker than what they expected, and we are seeing the same thing, and we haven't really figured out exactly why that is the case. Chris, you want to add something?
I'll just quickly add that while the Canadian dollar has depreciated, a lot of countries that Canada competes with in the U.S. market, their exchange rates have also fallen, and in some cases more. So that competitive edge that Canada, you would think the lower dollar would be providing, isn't as effective this time.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, especially with competing with Mexico in their labor advantage. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Raj. Mr. Albas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Parliamentary Budget Officer and your staff for being here today. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for what you do for our country. Let's start off with, first of all, just on the job numbers. In April, you had said that Budget 2016 had overestimated the number of jobs. Government had put forward a projection of 100,000 jobs, and your own projections had showed 60,000. Has that changed at all, given what we've seen since April?
In terms of our estimate of the impact of the stimulus, no, we haven't redone the impact of the stimulus. It's still too early to see exactly how that's going to affect.
Okay. But you still stand by the original projection that it's 60,000 versus 100,000?
That's based on our assumptions and model, yes.
So, again, you said that right now there's flexibility within the current framework. The question we actually asked the Governor of the Bank of Canada was a larger picture. You've pointed out in your recent fiscal sustainability report that new spending by the Liberal government had actually put us on a path of being financially unsustainable when you look from the lens of a federal provincial fiscal policy. Is that still the case?
Well, our latest FSR, which we have not updated yet, I think stays valid as far as we are concerned until the policies change. And based on that report, the federal government actually was in a position that they have room to spend or reduce taxes further based on the long-term sustainability criteria. It's the provincial governments that would be, they have some challenges there. So the federal government, if things don't change, actually the debt to GDP ratio at the federal level will continue to decline, whereas the provincial level we see the opposite, and that's the situation overall.
So many people at home might be interested to learn that right now on debt servicing at the federal level, we actually spend more on debt servicing than we do for healthcare transfers or even the military. So it is a sizable amount. But what you're saying is that currently within the government's own fiscal framework, we are sustainable. However, given the fact that there's no provision in our Constitution for how we handle provincial debt, if there was a default, that ultimately I think people would expect the federal government to take that. So and I see we have members from all across the country, is that something as parliamentarians you believe that we should be keeping an eye on, even as we speculate on the short-term run of the economy?
Certainly, overall, the financial situation of the country as a whole is important to watch, and that's why we do the fiscal sustainability report, and we provide a sort of the nationwide assessment of that. Total CPP, QPP, and the provincial, local, and the federal government.
Okay. In regard to,
and go ahead, Mr. Fichette.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just to add something on that, I think there was a question with the governor about the federal provincial, the fiscal sustainability report that we're doing is an aggregate measure of all the provinces. And I can tell you in the past 3 years, we had several requests from various members asking us to do it on a provincial basis. We don't do it because we don't have the capacity for now. I mean, it's a huge task to do, but it would be certainly an interesting task and analysis that the PBO team would like to do. Thank you.
Saying that if the government gave the PBO more money, you'd be able to do more things. Is that what I'm hearing, JD?
That's what I'm doing, including a federal provincial sustainability report.
I just wanted to be sure that I heard it right. Dan, go ahead.
No, that was an intervention by the chair that I do appreciate, Mr. Chair. They don't happen often. So feel free to do more like that. Now, just in regards, the government seems to have, you've said that there will be larger deficits in the short term. Eventually, there will be additional revenues that will come in. I think you said around 2021, 2022. Why is the government showing that it, are they underestimating revenues as far as, what's the difference between what the government is projecting and smaller deficits that you're projecting? They're projecting quite a bit more this year and for the next few years. Your office is saying there's less. Is it, are they underreporting their revenues or anticipating?
I think two things. In the very short term, obviously, our projection is more up to date. The government, we have to wait until next week when they provide their update and see exactly where they are in the very short term. But on average, over the 5 years, when we look at their projection of the deficit and our projection, the difference is really can be accounted for by the difference in the nominal GDP, that they have made an assumption to reduce the nominal GDP from the private sector's projection for prudence, as a prudence factor, and we do not take that into account. So that is really the difference between our projection and their
so it's the prudence factor is the main difference between the two. Okay. Lastly, and I believe I have short time, there are many parliamentarians that unfortunately do not get the benefit of hearing from all of you today. If there's one thing that sticks out in the public parliamentarian budget offices, it's just say what one thing you think that parliamentarians should be focusing on, as we look towards the November 1st economic update.
Well, I mean, the update is really has to be very similar to the kind of a report that we provide: economic situation projection for 5 years, and then fiscal projection, and any other, if the government, has any other news that, they sometimes they include those in the update. But it would be hard for us to tell you exactly what you have to look for. But I mean, the deficit profile
is there something that again, parliamentarians that don't have the ability to come to Finance Committee ask you, is there a suggestion of where they should be looking at?
Until we actually see the update, it would be difficult for us to say exactly what you have to look for.
Fair enough, and I do appreciate your answers today. Thank you.
Thank you both. Mr. Caron.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you once again for coming here. To start off, this is not meant to insult anyone, but Ms. Cadieux, the clerk, does us the doubtful honor of being the only woman among all the people present here at the table. And I would say that this is something that we're going to have to give some thought to in the future. Thank you once again for being here rapidly. You did say at the beginning that the projections that you published did not include either the measures that were taken by the Minister of Finance respecting the housing market or the approach to carbon pricing. Can you give me an idea of what the possible impact might be on the economy in your estimate? Or is it impossible to do so at the present time? We don't have any idea either for the carbon market or for the housing market. On carbon pricing, we did have a report some time ago on the possible impact that this could have on economic growth, but not necessarily on revenues as such. This is something that we have not had a chance to examine yet. Nonetheless, your document does take into account the changes that were made to the Canadian Child Benefit, including indexation for 2020, 2021, as mentioned by Mr. Duclos. In view of the fact that the announcement was made on Friday, if I'm not mistaken, we did not include this particular calculation. When you carried out your study on the federal child benefit, it was at the beginning of September. You did, in fact, mention that this program will apply to fewer and fewer families because of the fact that indexation was not provided. The Minister of Finance will be receiving a document. Before the publication, I'd like to know whether the government did give you some idea that indexing was being considered. It wasn't communicated to us. It was made known to us only following the publication. The Minister did say that the consideration would be given, but did not specify it before Friday. So for the time being, you haven't been able to extrapolate what the effect of this would be on public finances. No, we haven't done it yet, but we'll be doing it.
September 1st, in the annex, we actually presented this scenario with respect to indexation. And using the growth rates that were presented within that report, we would be looking at approximately roughly $1 billion within the first year. So on July 1st, 2020, when indexation takes effect, consistent with the proposal tabled on Friday, and then growing over time.
OK. Une question rapide pour revenir à un débat.
A quick question to return to debate. I did put the question in April, and there were some developments during the summer. The government put forward the idea of giving greater independence to the office of the parliamentary budget officer, as well as increasing the resources. There was some confusion during the summer about what exactly this meant. It would appear that there is going to be a bill. We certainly haven't heard about it yet. I'd like to know whether you have any information. No, we have no information. The two documents that you mentioned published this summer, there was one document that was leaked in the press. It wasn't a bill. The Prime Minister's office did ask us once during a meeting to prepare a legislative scenario to deal with the various measures that were announced in the election campaign. Independence, an increased budget, and the main fact being the calculation of promises made during the election campaign. There was something similar to a bill. It does not take in the form of a bill, and we prepared this. It takes into account various measures, bilingualism, and so forth. This is the document that we prepared. It was sent to the Prime Minister's office in May, and we were asked for a business case that is establishing the prices of all these measures. And since the month of June, there has not been any information at all. We haven't received any emails, any requests for information, telephone calls, meetings. If these measures are expected to be implemented, it is going to take a certain amount of time to provide for the financial resources to make an assessment of them and to make an adjustment to the new reality for the Office of the Parliamentary Budget. The financial resources are the easiest. We're not dealing with a legal text, but changing the legislation means that it would be a more difficult process, in my view. To return to your updated outlook, there's some mention here of employment. I think that the present trend is disturbing because we can see that the unemployment rate has remained fairly stable with little variation, and there seems to be a growing tendency to have precarious part-time work as opposed to full-time work. Is this a trend that you have observed? Is it something that you were able to confirm? And for the near and medium term, what is the expected impact on the Canadian economy? Have you done any studies on this? Do you expect to do so, or do you think, or do you have the answer already? We do, in fact, have a report that has been updated on this.
Report hopefully on Thursday on our labor market assessment. But I guess so one of the key things that we found is when we looked at all the labor market indicators relative to trend, the thing that really stood out is hours worked. and how this is, if you look at a number of indicators, unemployment rate, employment, they're pretty close to their trend levels, as suggested by demographics, but hours worked is below trend. And if you think about labor's input into the economy, it's really hours worked that's dragging this below trend, and that includes the fact that we've seen a lot of growth in part-time work relative to full-time work. So we actually have divided this, and we looked at different age groups, and we found that for particularly for prime age males, hours are way down, and even for some older age groups and younger females, hours are up. So so that's definitely something we're looking at, and on Thursday probably have some more hard figures for you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Guy, you're well over, but just on that question, I don't think did I catch you right? You said part-time work going to full-time work?
Yes, sorry. So
I was under the assumption there was less full-time work and more part-time work.
That's exactly what I meant to say, yes. So if you look at the last 12 months that we have data for, so from the third quarter of this year to the third quarter of last year, all of the jobs, the net jobs created in the economy were part-time, and there was actually a small contraction in full-time employment.
Okay, yeah, I think either I heard you wrong or you said it wrong. Don't matter. Well, we got it cleared up. One other question in that area, though. We're doing pre-budget consultations across the country, and I don't know whether your report has touched on this in any way. But what we're hearing out there from in the hearings is the mismatch of skills to jobs. Have you done anything in that particular area?
So I think we haven't looked at that in the report this year. So one thing we have looked at is sort of the regional outcomes, how outcomes for employment are very different across provinces, particularly between oil producing and places like BC and Ontario, where the employment outcomes tend to be stronger, and even among industries over the past year. So we've seen that the service sector employment growth has been quite strong, whereas in goods and mining, oil and gas, it's contracted. So not specifically skills mismatch, but you do see definitely different outcomes when you look at in different industries and provinces.
Yeah. Okay. Turning to Mr. Ouellette.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming here today. I was just looking at the projections for GDP growth, the gross domestic product, and the Bank of Canada said that they see growth of 1.1% in 2016, 2% in 2017, 2.1% in 2018. And you have similar projections, but in fact yours are a little bit more optimistic about growth. I was just wondering if you could explain those differences.
Sure. I think the biggest difference is in 2017, as you noted, the 2.3% versus 2% from the bank. And looking at least at the composition of growth, it appears that the bank would have a weaker contribution to growth from the housing market. So this may reflect some of the timing of the housing market, recently announced housing market measures. But for us, the sort of adjustment in the housing market occurs later on in the projection horizon.
Okay. You also mentioned in your report that employment insurance premiums, the rates were going down from $1.88 for every $100 in contributions to the new break-even point of $1.63 for every $100, meaning Canadians will have more money in their pockets if when they're working. What impact would that have on the economy?
Well, it's an additional money in the pocket of individuals, and obviously the firms also pay less for EI premium. So, but we haven't really separated that impact in our analysis exactly how that's gonna impact the economy.
So that's a good thing.
Well,
if you want the economy to grow.
Certainly, it has a positive impact.
Okay, perfect. This is actually a question for Tim Schultz. I was intrigued with your new report coming out in a few days, Thursday. I was just wondering if you had looked at Indigenous employment.
We have not.
Why have you not? It sounds like you looked at every province, but because I go into a lot of communities and they have 75% unemployment, and we're not really sure of the statistics. I'd like to know if those statistics are true. If they're not real statistics, how can government make really good policy in order to, make an impact, a positive impact in people's lives? And so, I know you're interested, but is there something you could do to, be looking into that?
So I can definitely, we rely quite heavily on Statistics Canada's labor force survey data. So we'd be happy to go look into the microfiles and the data and then see what we can find on that and get back to you and let you know, I guess, what we could do.
Well, I think it's important that actually the public know, because I think it's if there is 75% unemployment, I think if there were 75% unemployment in Alberta, there might be a small revolution. But Indigenous communities seem to be a little bit forgotten for so long that it's something that, the more light is shone on that, or shined, that we can make a difference. The next one actually concerns a question about, fiscal estimates. I think I have a few more moments. During the appearance on 29th of September 2016 before the House of Commons Committee on Finance, Sher Khan from the University of Ottawa's Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy advocated reforming the estimates process consistent with 2012 recommendations of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. And according to Mr. Khan, such an approach would allow parliamentarians to vote on program activities representing key business lines within government departments and get both financial and performance information to support their scrutiny. Now, would such a reform to the estimates process, in your estimation, enable parliamentarians to conduct more thorough review? And what other measures could help parliamentarians conduct a more thorough review of estimates?
Before I ask Jason to maybe elaborate a little bit more, as you are probably aware, the minister this morning appeared before the Government Operation Committee to table his new proposal about exactly what you mentioned. It's going to be interesting because our position is a little bit what the 2012 OGO Government Operation Report was about, more in line with programs, and certainly the big, and after that Jason will elaborate. He likes that issue a lot. The big problem will be for parliamentarians to have the time to review all those. If you have the best data, you still have or the best information, you still have the time and take the time to review all this. Jason?
Yeah, just to elaborate on the PBO's point, I think broadly speaking, the position that we've had in the office is that has been, going back to the 2012 Government Operations Committee report, it did represent a consensus among parliamentarians of all political parties with respect to the 16 recommendations that they recommended to the House of Commons at the time regarding how the estimates and budget process in the business of supply needed to be reformed in order to serve all parliamentarians better. And again, those 16 recommendations, for the most part, as Jean-Denis mentioned, we're focused on both the content, so the quality of the reports actually being presented to parliamentarians, but in addition to that, it was also a question of capacity. So capacity of which we play a very small, limited role, but also the capacity in terms of training available to parliamentarians and the time that are actually available to parliamentarians. So both a question of the time devoted by committees to actually look at the work, but also timing in terms of how much time you are actually provided to actually examine the work. So taking the example of the timing around which main estimates are tabled and how quickly the first appropriation bill actually has to be approved. You're currently waiting on Supplementary Estimates B, which will be the fourth appropriation bill, and how many weeks or how many days you actually have to devote to scrutinizing the additional billions of dollars worth of expenditure. So I think, again, going back to, for us, it's not for us to actually advocate a specific position to the House. Of course, consistent with the PBO's mandate, our role is to only analyze and perform research on the estimates. It's really up to the members around the table and the members in the House to determine what actually makes the most sense. But again, going back to the last time parliamentarians actually spoke on it, the 2012 report, it's a very good starting point.
Thank you. And on this particular issue, where part of the problem is on the budget documents, I've been around here a while, and in the early years in the budget documents, the budget itself, you could actually determine program by program in each department how much money was spent over a 5-year period, We can't do, that isn't done that way now. And so the budget documents, you have to do some, where it was clear, probably 93 to 97, 98, where it was clear where the money was spent. You could understand it easily looking at the budget document. You didn't even wait for the estimates. But that's not the case now. And so this does have to be simplified. It doesn't, we shouldn't have to take a lot of training. It's a matter of the Department of Finance laying out the figures in a way that they can be understood by a layman. Mr. Leipert.
You're in a position to make those changes now, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask a couple of questions about a slide that is in the, I believe this is your presentation, this slide, the one on...
Analysts of the Library of Parliament, but that slide is, I think, in their documents.
In the document, it's the gross domestic, 5-year gross domestic product and employment growth slide.
It's not our slide.
Okay.
Clear that up, Ron. That is not in the PBO's report. It comes out of the analysis done by the Library of Parliament.
Okay. Well, I guess let me just sort of preface it by saying this particular slide says year-over-year real gross domestic product growth and employment growth. It runs from Q1 of 2010 to the current quarter. It shows, with one blip for a couple of quarters, growth in the 3.5 to 2.5 to 3 range right up until Q1 of 2015. Does that sort of run true with what you have concluded?
Chris is looking into his
right. So, well, let's assume that the analysts have the information correct, because they always do.
To give them a copy of that.
We do have a copy.
They have one.
You have a copy,
yeah.
Okay.
What I'm curious to get your response to is, this seems to me to be a chart that shows real growth in the economy over the last 5 years of somewhere in the 2.5, 3% range. We consistently hear from the finance minister, and one of the reasons for plunging the country into a $30 billion deficit is the finance minister has consistently said we've gone through a period of slow economic growth. So who's right here? Are these numbers correct, or is the finance minister not looking at the right numbers, or is this a chart that doesn't necessarily reflect accurate?
I can't, I agree. I think those numbers are probably correct in that chart. I would agree with the statements that we have seen real GDP growth and employment growth moderate over the last several quarters. I think the issue is one more about what do we see going forward. I'm
interested in backwards.
Okay.
Would you disagree then that we have not had a period of slow economic growth over the last 5 years?
It's been slower compared to historical growth rates, even relative to estimates of potential growth rate as well. And that's partly why we have, if you recall, the Governor of the Bank of Canada saying is that the Canadian economy is operating well below its sort of sustainable capacity. So that's how you get to that point, by having growth that is weak and low.
Okay, this certainly doesn't reflect that, so I will follow that up at another time. I am interested in your analysis as we go through this budget year on revenue. I happen to represent an Alberta riding, and every day it's somebody new who's being let go by a company. Are you seeing the revenue from taxation, both corporate and personal, taking any kind of a hit in this fiscal year, or is it on target?
So for the current fiscal year, we did see that some of the slowdown in economic growth in Alberta did feed through to a lower forecast for personal income taxes over the near term. As for this most recent fiscal year in 2015-16, personal income tax revenues were relatively strong, partly owing to persons moving forward, recognizing income, especially higher income individuals, due to the new 33% tax bracket. But on balance, what we're seeing is that personal income taxes over the first few years of our projection are slightly weaker than we had anticipated last forecast, but that should rebound over our 5-year medium-term horizon.
Just clarification on that, if I could, Mr. Can you be a little more specific? You say the next few years are going to be below projections, but sort of years 4 and 5 will recover?
Yeah. So over years 3, 4, and 5, it should recover relative to our last forecast. However, we do see a slightly larger reduction in personal income tax revenues relative to our last forecast in the first 2 years of our projection.
Okay. Yeah, are you done? Am I done?
Well, you are, but if you got a quick one, because we've got a fair bit of time.
I'm okay.
Francisco. Mr. Sabera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Quick question. I haven't been able to reconcile. It seems that the growth numbers that are projected by the PBO are slightly higher than the growth numbers that I've seen from the monetary policy report. I think it's 0.2 in 1 year and 0.1. Is there anything there that you guys that the PBO is forecasting that the Bank of Canada is not picking up, or anything you can point to?
I would, for 2017, the gap between our growth projections is around 0.3 percentage points, and I think you could point to the housing market there. The Bank of Canada has a weaker or a larger negative contribution to growth in the Canadian economy for that year.
So because I think their projection is negative 0.3 for 17 on the housing market. Is the PBO flat on that?
No. Or? I think they have minus 0.2. I could be wrong, but we have a very small positive. For us, the adjustment in that in the housing market comes in the following year, and after that, it's a more gradual adjustment, but it's a very significant adjustment.
Okay. Secondly, so if I'm understanding this correctly, looking at in this modeling. With our commitment to invest $120 billion in infrastructure over the next 10 years, and looking at this forecast period, the government is still on track to reduce, or looking at our fiscal anchor, the debt to GDP ratio, incorporating our investment into infrastructure. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Just one minute out. One question that has struck me. We've committed as a government to introduce a policy with regards to looking at major infrastructure projects in balancing the needs of the economy and balancing the needs of the environment, and looking where WTI and Brent is, and I think the forecast we have. Be it today or outer, and then the gap versus where WCS is. And I think Western Canada Select is around $36 a barrel and change right now, and Brent and WTI is around $50 and change. I'm just curious, have you ever modeled the impact where that gap would narrow if we get a project to build a pipeline built to Tidewater with a new and improved environmental process? You ever model the implications on revenues and tax revenues from that?
Well, we haven't really modeled that. I mean, part of that difference, of course, is also the quality, the type of oil that you're measuring. It's not all the supply and the pipeline issue, but exactly how the pipelines would affect that difference, we don't really know. And we have never looked at that, you know, what if the gap closes to 0 or to 50% of what it is? No, we have not done that.
But a large portion of that discount is due to the bottleneck at in the Midwest United States. The name escapes me at that area there. I think my final question would be, or final comment, I think more than anything, is on page 10, on the last paragraph. You know, with budget 2016, we brought in an extra period of extra estimate of prudence in terms of the $40 billion adjustment. And, you know, we've seen the transitory factor of the Fort McMurray wildfire file come into effect. But we also, you know, there's a lot of global uncertainties that we're still dealing with and that I don't think are going to subside at all. So I would slightly disagree in terms of the language that's used in terms of where we forecasted nominal GDP to come in these 2 years. I think I would still call it prudent or prudence in forecasting. You've used other words, but I would still call it a prudent. So if you'd like to comment on that, that would be great. And then I'll leave it at that, Chair.
I'll ask Chris. Chris, if you remember last time we called him Mr. Prudence, so that's his field. So, Chris?
It is true that we have revised down our outlook for the level of nominal GDP. However, it hasn't been revised down by as much as that forecast adjustment factor. I think on average we've revised down our outlook by about $15 billion, just to put it in a rough ballpark. Again, the choice of characterizing it as excessive is really relative to historical experience and how we've seen the private sector misses. And at least historically speaking, it's very rare that you see both years come in so weak. I mean, we can put aside the longer term or the more medium term, but at least the 1 year and 2 years out, this is a very rare, outside of the Great Recession, that we see this happening. The last point I would just comment on again is about the use of prudence, that if, again, the government isn't constrained like households and businesses are, and when there are shocks to the economy, the government can absorb these, whereas it's very difficult for businesses and for households. So that and the current fiscal situation that Canada is in, I think, are other factors that you want to take into account in setting these adjustments. And it's also possible to have adjustments made on the opposite side. I'm sure there could be instances where the government might feel that there's some upside risk to the private sector outlook, but that's something that we just haven't seen historically. It's always been an adjustment to the downside.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you both. Turning to Mr. Deltel.
It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you, gentlemen, and I will make just 2 points before asking question. First of all, when I was in the provincial parliament, I asked many times to have the privilege in the province of Quebec to have that kind of institution. I think it's very useful. It's non-partisan. We have a clear indication of how things are running for this country, and thank you for all the job you're doing. We all know that it's not very easy. That was the first point. And the second point, I want to pay all my respect to Mr. Fréchette, parce que Monsieur Fréchette, vous avez été le premier officier.
Mr. Fréchette, you were the first non-parliamentary Canadian officer to greet me a year ago when I came to the House of Commons, and I certainly appreciated your courtesy. I have 2 points that I'd like to raise with Mr. Fréchette. First of all, now that we've completed the first year management of the new government. There's been a lot of confusion in the fact that in the previous parliament, did it leave a surplus, a small surplus? Can we inform Canadians about what the state of the Canadian government's finances were a year ago? I took up this position at the end of the year 2015 and 16. If we set aside all the measures that were taken in 2016 budget from the month of November, essentially we'll see that the government finished with a surplus of $3 billion. $2.9 billion rather than having a deficit of $1 billion as was reported. Thank you. I think we should keep this in mind. We know that 3 weeks ago, the Minister of Finance unilaterally decreed, and we assume without any consultation, new standards and new rules relating to mortgage rates. This has an effect on all Canadians, even if we agree with the basic principle that we have to deal with the challenge presented by the housing bubble in Vancouver or in Toronto. In Quebec City, prices of houses went down by 4%, and in Calgary and Alberta, there are economic problems, of course, and they are affected as well. Do you think that these new rules will have an effect on the economic growth in Canada and the revenue of the government of Canada? We have not made an estimate. This is something that we did not calculate in our update. We'll probably do so the next time we make an update, but for the time being, we don't have anything on this. There was some reference made previously to businesses who, according to the Bank of Canada, create jobs and wealth. These businesses are fragile. There are a number of factors affecting them, including exports. Do you think that a tax that is maintained at 11% when it should have gone down to 9% is a stimulus for the economy or not? I'll ask Tim to give an answer since it's his area.
Calculated the fiscal and economic impact of the decision to maintain the small business tax rate at 10.5% instead of its legislated decline to 9%. We found that over five years, at the end of 2021, there'd be a negative impact on real GDP of $300 million, and it would reduce the level of employment by about 1,240 jobs created or maintained.
Merci bien. Est-ce que vous avez également fait la même étude concernant l'implantation?
Did you also do the same study relating to the the implementation of the liberal carbon tax? No, we didn't do any calculations on carbon emissions. As I explained previously, we did a report some months ago on the impact that this could have on the GDP per capita, but we didn't do it in revenue terms. And what did it show for per capita? We were talking about a $100 rate. It resulted in $1,400 drop per capita in the GDP. And with respect to Canada Pension Plan, we are in the process of debating Bill C-26 in the House of Commons. It is estimated that it would cost up to $2,000 per employee. That is $1,000 for the entrepreneur and $1,000 for the employee. Do you think that this is a measure that will encourage economic growth?
We have estimated the amount of revenue that will be collected as a result of this tax, and by 2021, that will be about $6 billion, which is about almost a quarter of a percentage point of GDP. So certainly, this is an impact on households that are paying that tax and the businesses that are paying that tax, but the amount is very small. So overall, in terms of the impact of GDP, it would be very small. We haven't really done that study, but it is going to be very small because the amount of revenue that's going to be generated will be very small.
We're talking about a reduction?
Reduction we are talking about the increase in the revenues that the government will collect and the reduction in the disposable income of households.
Thank you. Time's up on that. I would question, Mr. Scarra, whether you should call this payroll deduction a tax or not. Mr. McKinnon.
En effet, commençons là. Il s'agit d'une bel et bien.
I think that this is where we have to start. We're talking about a premium rather than a tax.
The payroll is a payroll deduction, whether you call it a tax or something else. That's really, I mean, that's an issue that has been debated for a long time, and different people have different views on that.
Mes excuses pour le.
My apologies for this abrupt departure, but I would like to welcome Mr. Frechette and his team and thank all of you for the work that you are doing. I'm not surprised to see that Mr. Dertel did draw attention to your courtesy, Mr. Frechette, since you come from Gatineau, and where everyone is very courteous. I'd like to look at the decisions that the government will have to take, and the committee will be taking, with relation to the next budget, the budget for 2017-18. We'll be hearing from Mr. Barton, who, as you probably know, is chair of the Committee on Growth, advising the Minister of Finance. And I think that what he will be telling us, judging on his recent reports, is that Canada should be increasing its immigration rates. I'd like to know how an increase in the levels of immigration in Canada will affect, or what approach you take to dealing with this particular question of increasing the immigration rate in your economic models.
Sustainability report, and that is driven to a great extent by demographic factors, and certainly an increase in immigration will increase the labor force over time, and would help in that sense. It would help in terms of the overall economic growth. But we have done simulation. I don't have those in front of me right now. We have done simulation in our fiscal sustainability report in terms of how big that impact is. And from what I remember, the impact of raising the immigration by a reasonable amount on the overall fiscal sustainability is not going to be very significant. But whether or not you increase immigration, there are many other reasons for doing that, which we are not really taking into account, and we can't really comment on.
On nous parle souvent de plafond naturel.
We've often heard about a natural ceiling for growth imposed by our demography, whether it be in Quebec or in Canada as a whole. We talk about the short-term effects. Short-term, of course, there are certain integration expenditures, but you might see then a higher ceiling, so to speak, on for growth, for long-term growth. In that case, we might be in a better financial situation.
In terms of the overall potential growth for the country as you increase the labor force and the labor input into the economy. But how big that impact is, as I said, I don't have those numbers in front of me, but from what I recall, they weren't that big. But there is certainly positive.
Si je peux me permettre juste un petit commentaire.
If I might make a short comment, as Mustafa is saying, that presently we don't know what the policy is. That is, immigration to make up for the aging population is one thing. I know that there are provinces who talk about investor agreements. They give more emphasis to this. All these factors can have a marginal effect on the growth rate of the economy. But for the time being, since we simply had a figure that was bandied about, we don't know whether this is going to be established as a target, and it is difficult for us to make any comment. But of course, we're talking about something that is quite abstract right now. A second point, I believe, judging from what Mr. Barton said, he will probably be recommending the government that we match the money from private investors, that is retirement funds, either foreign or domestic, and that we add to the federal expenditures for infrastructure private investments in infrastructure, and this would leverage the effect then of our investments in strategic infrastructure in the country. Once again then, in relation to assessing future growth, do you consider this would be a good thing? We're dealing, of course, here with something fairly general right now, but do you think that this could eliminate another impediment to our growth?
Principle, any kind of investment, especially investment in infrastructure, will increase potential growth. And so in that sense, if you are looking for growth, that's a good thing. But whether it's a good decision or not, that's something that we cannot obviously comment on. That's a policy question.
Mais je parlais juste dans l'abstrait.
I was talking about in general terms, that is multiplying spending beyond the government's capacity, adding considerable amounts of money then in investments and infrastructure. If $1 invested by the federal government in infrastructure is the equivalent of X% in growth within the GDP, do you think that multiplying these amounts and investing in economically strategic infrastructure would, in your opinion, mean that this ceiling on our potential growth could be raised higher? Just one comment, and I'll ask Chris to add a very short comment. You talk about the infrastructure bank. Infrastructure spending with the private sector, allowing, for example, retirement funds to have some performance on their funds. I think that it was mentioned that it is a very long time to have the economic spin-offs of infrastructure spending. The multiplier is 2, 4, or 8 over a period of 8 years. Do you have any comment on this?
When we did prepare our assessment of the economic impact of different types of government measures from Budget 2016, we did find that the multiplier effect, or the increase from $1 of spending, was very similar, whether that was government undertaking the increased capital formation, or whether that was coming from the private sector. They were very close, and both would raise the level of GDP, and therefore have a positive impact on government revenues.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop your way over, Steve. Mr. Carroll.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to your report, your follow-up report on spending at the end of the month of September, when you talked about the difference, that is the additional expenses made by the government in relation to forecasts. In the same period in the previous fiscal year, there was $1.2 billion of this increase that was due to commitments made by the government in matters of infrastructure. My question then is it possible to determine what the economic spin-offs of these investments are? And if either yes or no, can you tell us how long it is necessary to wait before we can see these economic benefits?
The benefits we could be getting.
Avant de demander à Jason peut-être de répondre une partie de cette question-là, ce qui est intéressant.
Jason, to answer part of the question. What is interesting is that we did have a request from a Senate committee to monitor infrastructure spending. So this is something that we've been watching quite closely, and it would be possible for us to provide information. The objectives of this National Finance Committee, and we met them in a public meeting. They asked us to do this, and they are interested in doing so as in relation to green infrastructure and to find out whether there is a greater multiplier effect in cases of green investments. This is what we are doing, and we haven't completed the work yet.
With respect to our ability to actually assess the real impact on the economy from the jump we saw in first quarter's cash flows coming out from the government, the short answer is neither yes nor no. It's not yet. That said, obviously there's a lag associated with that, and the lag will depend on the nature of the projects. And as Jean-Denis mentioned, our office has initiated work working with many federal departments and agencies to actually identify the specific projects that they're undertaking with infrastructure funding. And to the best of our knowledge at this point, the list is at least over 1,000 and growing at this point in terms of those individual projects, both with start dates and end dates and the specific locations of the projects. So I think stay tuned.
That begs the question, do you have enough resources to actually take on such a major undertaking?
I think Jean-Denis is better placed to respond to that question, but I, for myself, having been with the office since 2008, thankfully we have the same person on staff who actually undertook that project in 2009. He led that project pretty much single-handedly, and thankfully he's still with us now. I noticed that he's losing some hair, but I think we're adequately resourced, simply owing to the high quality of staff we currently have.
On vit d'espoir d'avoir plus de ressources, comme j'ai mentionné auparavant.
Increasing resources, yes, as I said, when we deal with these projects, I know that parliamentarians would like to have an answer next week, but these are projects that last for several months. Once we have the results of this study, it may be a year, but we are not saying no to the committee because we think it is important for this to be done. I should mention, Jason said that we asked 28 departments and agencies to provide us with their data. We've had a very good response rate, and I think that this is a positive development. We haven't seen each other since the month of April, and you've prepared a number of reports since then. Returning to the report on June, in this particular report, you talked about the dangers that would relating to subnational governments, that is provinces, in relation to their debt. And the situation is not necessarily improving. In this particular report, you mentioned that provincial governments and local governments would have to generate $30 billion annually in order to maintain their debt burden, present burden of debt at the present level. So my question then is in relation to this report that you've just published. In the past 6 months or the past year, are there measures that you can identify taken by the federal government to provide assistance to the provinces and municipalities in dealing with their debt burden?
In terms of the measures that the government federal government has done, I cannot name any right now that would help provinces to deal with their shortfall.
Est-ce que vous diriez que l'avertissement est...
Do you consider that the warning is still in effect?
The situation in which provinces and municipalities are in terms of their debt levels and how much it would take to actually just sustain their current situation?
Yes, of course. I mean, the situation for the provinces in terms of their debt and the future debt profile is still the same. That hasn't changed.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Caron, I have to stop you there. Mr. Albertea.
Yeah. I have a couple of things to ask about. You mentioned the carbon tax and the carbon tax analysis, that the impact will be $1,400 on the GDP per capita. Is that figure correct? Did I hear that correctly?
GDP per capita.
Pardon?
GDP per capita.
Yes, per capita.
GDP, yeah.
So that's about $50 billion based on the calculation, which is equal about 2.5% of the GDP.
Let me just clarify that point. The study that we did a while ago on the climate change and the impact of a tax was actually, that impact came from not directly from us. It came from the Roundtable on Environment and Economy, and it was based on a hypothetical situation. Now, the current announcement that the government made on the tax that they are planning to impose, that we don't really have enough information exactly how that's going to work out. It all depends on how the provinces are going to react to this, how they're going to recycle the money that they're going to receive from this. And that, with all that information, then we can actually sit down and measure the overall impact of that change. Right now, it would be very difficult to actually pinpoint a number and say, well, that would be the impact.
I do appreciate that, and I know, I agree with you on this, but if this figure, I made some kind of calculation, I mean, is not to the point where I do have that time and the ability to do so. But this is a very scary number. We're talking $50 billion on the size of the Canadian economy. It's a huge, regardless how the money is going to be circulated, because we know that, some of that could be wasted here and there, and that, we could not benefit whatsoever from it, rather than it's an imposing of taxation on Canadian. The other question is, on a CPP, also, you mentioned the $6 billion figure, which equal to 0.25% of the GDP. Economically, I call this artificial growth of the GDP rate, because it's we're collecting extra taxes from people, and then we put in the economy and we call it growth on the GDP. Am I correct?
Sorry, I didn't call it growth in GDP. I was just talking about the amount relative to the GDP. I wasn't saying that this is going to increase growth in GDP. I was just saying that this is equal to 0.25% of GDP.
Beautiful. That's and thank you. I just want to clarify that. Now, CPP is going to do, the $6 billion on one side, and then we have job reduction, wage freezing, and then maybe reluctance on the appetite of consumers to spend because of the less income at the end of the day. Have these figures or have these factors been calculated into the overall picture of the impact?
All these, as we mentioned in the report, the CPP impact is already taken into account in our baseline projection. So it is all there. That's right.
Okay. Do I have more time?
Yes, you do.
Thank you very much. You're really generous.
I know. All kindness and heart.
Okay. A question, a very common question. I believe we asked that question before. Do we have a revenue problem, or do we have a spending problem in Canada?
I don't know whether we have a revenue problem or a spending problem. What we do the projection, and the bottom line is the fiscal deficit or fiscal surplus, and that's what really matters at the end. Do we have a revenue problem? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't know whether we have a revenue problem or a spending problem. These are decisions by the government to spend money and raise taxes in the way that they wish to do so. And I can't say whether it's good or bad in that sense.
Thank you.
You done?
Yeah.
That's just one quick question, Joe.
Mr. Scar, thank you so much for attending, and your whole team. The past 3 hours, we've heard a lot of economic analysis, fiscal, monetary. It seems as if we're having a TA in an economic department, which is very, very helpful to us as a government and as opposition members in devising economic policy. Perhaps I can ask if there would be any advice that you would have for hardworking Canadians who may not be in tune with economic jargon, but are looking out into the future and are making plans. What things that they can be looking for towards buying a house, mortgage payments, getting prepared for their kids' education, some practical advice to some folks who are not into the difference between economic and policy on the fiscal side. Kind of change pace a bit. Very thorough 3 hours of a lot of good issues.
I mean, I don't consider myself a financial advisor for households, so I don't know whether I want to provide that kind of advice.
On the public policy side.
I mean, in the public policy, our job is to evaluate the impact of public policy on the overall fiscal situation in Canada, and that's what we have done with this report. And we normally don't go beyond that in terms of providing advice and assessing whether it's a good or bad.
That's it.
Is there anything else that witnesses want to say as a last word, JD? Or okay. No. Then, on behalf of the committee, we would certainly thank you for all the work you do, and I guess you'd call it constructive criticism of the government's fiscal and monetary plans. We appreciate that, and it's always helpful for us in terms of doing our analysis as well. So, thank you very much, and meeting adjourned.
Thank you.